Superannuation is one of those things that is often easily overlooked. And a lot of people, misconception is that when you leave the country, you can take your superannuation with you. The rules of preservation still apply. Yeah. So it's still stuck in the system until you're, 60 and no longer working, or 65 and regardless of your work status.
Yeah, I mean, there are some...
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics such as investing, cash flow, budgeting, saving, passive income, debt management, and much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, here we are back on the 360 Money Matters podcast.
Andrew, we are back. Favourite time of the week, bringing a whole heap of value to our listeners and our viewers. Today is not going to be any different. Something a little bit different in terms of the topic, but the value, no difference. It's always there, week in, week out. Wednesday episodes drop. Andrew, what are we talking to everybody about today?
Yeah, so today we're giving ourselves some personal advice. So we're talking about when you're living or working overseas, what are some of the tips and tricks that you need, or what are some of the things that you need to know when you're, potentially living overseas, whether it's for a period of time or permanently, and still have assets in Australia. And the reason that's relevant to us is because we're both retiring, we're moving to the Greek islands, and so we need to know, how do we manage our finances from the Greek islands, from Santorini?
I like your thinking, Andrew. Maybe in summertime we'll move there. In winter, I heard it's really boring and there's not really much happening, right?
It's all right. We're close enough to the rest of Europe to
fair enough. Fair enough. Love the thinking. Love the thinking. So just to highlight this or frame it, I think it's just more so ideas and things to think about and consider. A highly complicated area because every part of the world treats assets, income, tax rules, residency, everything is completely different. So from our perspective, just things to think about. Starting on that, residency rules and tax obligations. Once again, different depending on where you are in the world. How does Australian tax residency work? If you've got assets here versus assets overseas, if you're living overseas and you're deriving income, how is that taxed? What's your tax status look like? Whole range of different things to consider in that one.
Yeah, and I think the first thing is, are you a tax resident of Australia or are you a tax resident of somewhere else? And really that depends on where you spend the majority of your time. If you spend the majority of your time in Australia, I think it's 180 days, then you're a tax resident of Australia. If you don't, then you're a tax resident of somewhere else. And so understanding whether you are a tax resident or not, and, are you at a risk of, being taxed in two jurisdictions? Is there a double tax agreement with where I'm going? And so usually these are some of the considerations that you're talking about when you're taking a job overseas or should be. Because I think that the most common example is, someone that's maybe living in Australia, has assets in Australia, has taken a job overseas, and you want to know what your tax obligations are going to be before you decide to move.
What's worse than paying tax? Paying double tax.
That's definitely the truth.
But yeah, geez, wouldn't that be crap?
And it happens. And I think that a lot of people get caught out with it because they don't receive advice and they just assume that things are going to happen. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not always fair. So it does depend on the countries that you are going to and where you're going to be living. Because if there isn't a double tax agreement, then all of a sudden you can be liable to pay tax in both countries, and maybe you've already spent all or a portion of that money, and all of a sudden you're overseas. You maybe don't have the same level of support. You've run out of cash, and you also need to pay your tax obligations. It can be really messy.
Currency exchange and transfer costs. So obviously, whatever country you're in and deriving income from, if you receive your income in that local currency, obviously there's that. Do you keep it in that currency? Do you transfer it back to Australia? If you do, exchange rates, and obviously that can vary at a different point in time depending on what's happening. Transfer cost is another big one as well too, especially the larger the amount of money that you're transferring, the bigger the cost associated with it as well too. So needing to have a really good understanding of what that looks like. There's a bit of a timing strategy as well too. I mean, you look at where exchange rates are and have been and predict to go in the future, you know, depending at a point in time, they can move quite rapidly all over the place. So having a really good understanding of what that looks like and a strategy around that, just because you don't want to be leaving money on the table because you haven't given it any thought or any particular planning. One of the ways to think about that is multi-currency accounts, to be able to have different bank accounts in different areas with different currencies. Maybe that prevents you from needing to transfer across. So as an example, you know, you've got some assets in Australia, they pay income into an Australian bank account in AUD. Then say you're working overseas in Santorini, so we're getting paid in euro. Maybe we keep it in, you know, a Greek bank account over there and pay for our expenses while we're over there in European dollars. Whole range of ways to think about it, but something that can't be understated and overlooked because it can get quite expensive if you get it wrong.
Yeah, and you need to, I mean, you consider most household budgets, right? And there's an element of variability in your expenses. But if you've, let's say, got an amount of money that needs to come back to Australia to, let's say, service a mortgage or, you know, do any number of things that, in this assumption that you're probably going to come back to Australia to you know, to live at some point in time. But, okay, so I need to transfer an amount of money back to Australia in Australian dollars. But that currency can change over time. So all of a sudden, I need to have a bigger buffer in my cash flow strategy, because if I need to transfer $1,000 a month, for argument's sake, in Australian dollars, and my cash flow is really tight while I'm overseas, and all I can afford is $1,000 a month, all of a sudden, nothing changes. All of your expenses are the same, but there's a change in the currency. Now, all of a sudden, I need to be putting 10%, 15%, 20% more because of that change in the exchange rate. So making sure that if you are going to be transferring money back to, you know, meet a debt obligation or meet, you know, pay for kids, pay for school fees, whatever it is, you need to make sure that there's a buffer in there, because you can get caught out with your cash flow running incredibly tight. When there's changes in currency conversion costs.
Yeah. No, well said. Superannuation, probably one that is often overlooked and not necessarily considered. Moving overseas, thinking that you can take your superannuation with you, not going to happen.
Yeah.
Do you still need to contribute to super while you're working overseas? Is your employer contributions with a foreign company? Is it with an Australian company? What does that look like? I'm speaking in really general terms because it's different depending on where you live, where you work. What does that then look like as well too? But superannuation is one of those things that is often easily overlooked. And a lot of people, misconception is that when you leave the country, you can take your superannuation with you. The rules of preservation still apply. Yeah, so it's still stuck in the system until you're, 60 and no longer working, or 65 and regardless of your work status.
Yeah, I mean, there are some superannuation funds that will allow some transfers cross-border. So, you know, KiwiSaver is kind of one of the big ones, as well as like a UK pension. So you can transfer to those countries and vice versa, but then at the same time, there's also the rules of preservation in those countries, and usually the rules of preservation are exactly the same, which is why you're allowed to transfer it to those countries. So it still needs to stay in a superannuation environment. I guess some of the thoughts and some of the things you need to consider is, do I continue contributing to a super fund? If I am contributing to the super fund, do I have income to offset in Australia, and is it above the tax-free income threshold? So do I make pre-tax contributions in concessional contributions to super? Do I make after-tax contributions into super so that I can still continue to accumulate wealth, but I don't have any income to offset, so I don't want to pay 15% contribution tax. I want to, you know, dollar for dollar the money that goes in. But understanding what your goals are and understanding what you're trying to achieve will help inform whether you firstly make contributions, whether you don't make contributions, and if you do, how those contributions are made as well.
Really good segue, Andrew, into investing in assets in other countries. Yes. So cross-border investing, whole range of things to take into consideration. Obviously, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the tax position. So not only in terms of the income that's being derived from that investment.
Actually, I'm going to go back to one thing. Sorry. I just realized that you need to consider, just to cut you off there before we jump into it, self-managed super fund. So if you do have a self-managed super fund, you need to consider whether, if you are moving overseas, you're ineligible to be a member of a self-managed super fund. So you do need to actually close that down. If there's a property, if there's other members, closing that down, what are the implications of it? Can they pay you out? So when you are talking superannuation, particularly self-managed super fund, that's a really key thing, in that if you've got a member that's going overseas, there are implications associated.
Yeah, no, good point. But speaking of overseas, so from a taxation perspective, income.
Yep.
So the assets most likely going to produce income. So thinking about it from a tax consequence from that perspective, capital gains tax as well too when you do sell the asset.
Yep.
If you're, in a country where they start to talk about what we're talking about in Australia, taxing unrealised gains, no, that's just a shot at the government nice and early in the morning. Making sure that you get your tax or your reporting correct, and that the accountant who is doing the annual work for you actually is aware of and has the skill set to be able to manage assets overseas as well too. Yeah. Absolutely huge one. And probably the one to think about first and foremost is, what structure do you purchase these assets in? What's the right way to own these things?
Yeah.
Is the structure that we've got here in Australia, is that recognised overseas? Do you need to open up an entity overseas? Whole gamut of different things to take into consideration. Gets a lot more complicated than just, hey, this is the asset that I need to invest in. How far and wide that goes, I guess it depends on where you're going with your investments, what country, whole range of different things. There's probably, now versus any other point in time, I'd say there's more skill set available in the market, more information available, because people have done it before. So living overseas is not as big of a deal as what it once was, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So it is happening a lot more common these days, especially because people are chasing, sort of lower tax countries and things like that. But thinking about all the ramifications associated with investing across borders is really significant.
Yeah.
And then you go and add the place of domicile as well too, and that adds a sort of cherry on top of the cake.
Yeah, exactly right. And you need to start making the decision around, what does this look like? Am I moving for a period of time, and in which case I want to transfer money back to Australia or invest in Australia and, still have someone, maybe you have a power of attorney in Australia to, manage those assets while you are overseas. Maybe you have a financial advisor to, be able to advise on those assets while you are overseas. But what's going to be right for you depends on your situation. I mean, if you're going to retire overseas, then maybe it is, hey, let's sell the assets in Australia and move that overseas. Maybe it's, hey, there's more opportunity in Australia to, maybe if you're retiring overseas, continue to hold money in superannuation, take a pension out of it because it's a zero tax environment, then transfer that overseas, which is going to have some costs from a transfer cost and an exchange rate, but making sure that you're doing what's right for you and your circumstances, because for some people, it's move your assets overseas. For other people, it's retain your assets in Australia and just, transfer across the assets and the income that you're going to live off. Is it temporary? Is it permanent? Are you not sure and you want to keep things flexible? Yeah, really depends.
Then go and add considerations like healthcare, social security, pensions. It's not an easy decision, and it is different for absolutely everybody as well too, right? So not impossible, but just needing to know what the lay of the land looks like from that perspective.
Sort of protection do you have in place, right?
Well, yeah, we talk about estate planning, I guess, in terms of what that looks like.
Well, estate planning is one, but even, you move money to a bank account overseas. So, within Australia, if you've got $200,000 in a bank account and something happens with that bank, it's government backed and it's guaranteed. if you're overseas, do you still have that same level of protection? Is that relevant? I mean, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe you're worried about that risk, maybe you're not. But if you're not aware of it, it can be something that you do get caught out on. And generally speaking, Australia, from a consumer protection, relatively high standards, and maybe you don't have those same protections overseas and you're just not aware of it.
And on the protection front, now I know where you were going with it, from an insurance perspective as well too. If you've got insurance, is in place, do they operate in a different country? Does it offer worldwide cover? What does that then look like? So needing to be really mindful around understanding the lay of the land and what the contracts are and how that protection covers you, or in fact does not cover you, and maybe you need to get something new when you go to a new country from that perspective. But where I was going before with the estate planning is, is your will specific for the assets in that particular country? Does it cover assets that you've got, assets that you've got in different parts of the world? Needing to get specific legal advice on that, because every jurisdiction is different.
Yeah, exactly right. Especially when you start talking about inheritance tax, and, some countries will have that, other countries won't have that. Superannuation will have some sort of inheritance tax when you're talking about tax paid to beneficiaries. Do you consider, I think that the big sort of takeaway in all of this is you need to get advice. And you need to get advice from the right people. I mean, one is getting financial advice around your investments and your structures, and, making sure that things are set up from a cash flow side of things and all of that. But then you also need to consider advice from an accountant. And maybe that's not your regular accountant that you've used in the past, because they don't have that expertise of international investments or in the country that you're moving to. Maybe it is, but making sure that the people that you're talking to know the tax rules within the country that you're moving to as well, and can, advise you on that. Yep.
Andrew, it was a little bit packed in that in a really short period of time. Quite a complicated area, something that we advocate for getting advice for. You're not going to go into this thing without doing your research. The ramifications can be really significant from that perspective. And the longer that you're in another country, the more that can compound and multiply as well too. So get advice. Hopefully we've given our viewers and our listeners a whole heap of things to think about if they are considering either moving overseas or purchasing assets overseas as well too. Andrew, thank you for today.
Bills, thanks again for another great podcast. To our viewers and our listeners, if you've got any questions on that, feel free to reach out to Billy or myself. Details in the show notes. And subscribe, and we look forward to catching you on the next podcast. Thanks.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
The information in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into account your personal objectives, financial situation, or needs. It is not financial, legal, or tax advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should consider whether the information is appropriate to your circumstances and seek professional advice before acting on any of the information provided. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorized representatives and credit representatives of Akumin Financial Planning Pty Ltd.